Welcome to Keller's Coder, and today we will have a look at this tiny little gesture proximity light measuring sensor. Motherfucker!
Bye, bitch!
So I came across these tiny little gesture proximity sensors. Cost around $5 each, so I bought a couple, hooked them up and figured, what can I do with these? Since I always wanted to learn React and play around with the Mosquitto broker for MQTT, I figured let's hook this sensor up to a Raspberry Pi, install Mosquitto broker on it. When I make a gesture, that gesture is interpreted by the module and the code, generates a message in the message queue. The React app is a subscriber on that message queue, interprets the message and triggers the event that otherwise would have been triggered by clicking the buttons on the UI. Is it convoluted? Yes. Does it show the purpose of this tiny little module? Yes. Is it useless? Yes. But let's jump in and have some fun with this tiny little gesture sensor. So it's wired up to the Pi. The voltage is 3.3 volts. Don't drive this with 5 volts, it will break. I had to solder the PS bridge and the I2C pull-up resistors, otherwise it wouldn't work on the Raspberry Pi. So that's these two little pads that you have to just put a blob of solder on. Then it's connected to 3.3 volt. Clock data for I2C. An interrupt, you need an interrupt connected if you want to do motion sensing, and the ground. So it's basically the first 5 pins on the inside row of the 40-pin header of the opposite side of your connectors. So what I then did was download the library APDS9960. This is the name of the module for Raspberry Pi. It came with a couple of little examples and you have to compile them as such. You compile the library CPP, you compile the example gesture in this case, you link it to, in my case, Mosquitto, because I generate a message and write it in the Mosquitto library, and Wiring Pi, that is the IO library. And just have a little look. I just updated this gesture test CPP code by adding in, here we go, the MQTT connect. This is the first time that I use Mosquitto. It's really a kind of cool broker. So we connect to it right here. So I give this Mosquitto structure. That is something that you require. It's basically a C library. The host, the port, whether you want to clean the messages in the session, yes please. Username and password that I have set on the Mosquitto broker. Then it just initiates Wiring Pi, initiates. Yeah, I lived in London for a bit. Initiate. It sets up the I2C for it. It checks everything. And then it goes into an infinite loop, and it is basically triggered by the interrupt that you need to set before you go. So I create a little start script. You need to run the sudo GPIO H7 falling. 7 is that pin where the yellow wire is connected to. And that will trigger a interrupt every time that is pulled low. And then it just analyzes the gesture based by is gesture available. And this is what I've added. That is the publish into the message queue KFMD, kill, fuck, marry, dump, underscore publisher, pub. And this just runs always and senses for these motions. Now let's have a brief look at Mosquitto. You can just install that with the apt install Mosquitto, and I also installed apt install Mosquitto dev or libdev in order to be able to program against C++. Right. So this is the configuration. If you want to use this with React or any web application, you need WebSockets to be available. The MQTT JS library is not able to actually connect to the MQTT port itself. It needs to be on a WebSocket port. So I added the 9001 protocol WebSockets, and I also said I don't want anonymous access to this, even though it's on my internal network, but I just want a password file. So the password file looks like this. You just create a file with the username and the password. And you just run Mosquitto pass WD on it, and it will translate the password file into an encrypted password. So that was setting up Mosquitto. The biggest deal was actually doing the React app. So let's have a look at that. So this is what I wanted to make. 4 buttons, and if you click on a button, a sound plays, appropriate for dictator, and the image will move towards that button. And when in the middle, it will renew the image. And then we also want to have messages being sent to simulate these button presses like this. So that we don't have to interact with the buttons itself, but we can just interact with the sensor. So here we have the React app. I started off with a function component, but I quickly ran into the problem that function components do not allow you to directly use low-level JavaScript libraries. So I had to create a class component that extends from components. And these are my states that I track. You need to call the constructor of the component, of course. And here I included the MQTT. My own little topic, which is basically just a button. I should have put this in the directory components. I did not, but this button is just reused. I can disable it because when the game is done, you cannot click on it. When an animation is playing, you cannot click on it. So that's the constructor. Here are my credentials for the broker. I don't care that you can read them because these are not my usual passwords and usernames. And here I connect straight to my Raspberry Pi that runs the MQTT Mosquitto broker on a WebSocket. So that is the IP address, the port number, and the options which are passed, which is the client ID, username, and the password. So basically the web app is now subscribed after this call to this channel and reads messages. So on connect, I set the status to connected. I subscribe to this channel for messages. I set on the status bar that we're ready to play. And then on a message, we call the call event function that I created, and we convert the message into a string. And when we go away from the page, we actually disconnect it and we close the session from the MQTT client. Here we perform the action. That is actually, we simulate what would be happening if you actually click the buttons. So if we first have a look at the render, we just see we have a grid layout. It's basically a 3x3 grid layout. We have the buttons, which I call topic. We have an image on there, the disabled state, and on click we would actually trigger that perform action. We have the action that we want to perform that is associated with that button. So kill, fuck, marry, dump. So let's have a look at that. So here we perform that action. We set the state to is disabled. So we disable all the buttons during that animation that plays for 2 seconds. I set it to an uppercase and we play the animation, or we set the animation what to play from the CSS. We play the sound and that's basically it. Then we wait until the animation is basically finished, 2 seconds. These are very strict timings, so you can actually get away with a timeout. That was kind of cool. Here we get a new celebrity after the animation is played. We because it would not make sense if the photo changes when we are moving it to a button. So when it's back, then we change the celebrity. Here we basically do the same thing when we have an event. So if that event is U, LRD, or these keywords, whatever you put in the message queue, it will perform that same action as we just saw that the buttons would do. Here we get a celebrity. We make sure that we only get celebrities that here we have not yet seen. So we have a list of celebrity images which reside in the directory public celebs. So this is just hard-coded, didn't have time to actually have a little API to pull a random image, but you could actually do that. That is relatively simple, I have to say, with React. So here I just select an image that we not have had yet. We set the appropriate states. If we have had all the images, so what we had is the same as the length of the celeb array, then the game is over. So we disable all the buttons, we set the state to game over, and we show you're done. And this is the first time that you actually have a clean state that we set a image. Here we play the sound, which is very trivial, I have to say, in React, although you do have to click on the UI to give focus, otherwise the play won't play the sound. So you just need to click once on the web page and you will hear the sound, otherwise it's not registered. And like I said, this is the UI. So yeah, that's really this simple. The animation magic happens in the CSS. Now I'm sure this could be done a lot more efficient. This is really the first time that I really dove seriously into CSS. I don't care about it really, but that animation required some keyframes. So here we move the first 50% we move down, or yeah, down in this case, which weirdly enough is moving up. And then when we're at the top, we move back to the center, and this takes 2 seconds. And that's why the whole timeout was 2 seconds before we refreshed the image. So I have these animations for each of the directions that we can go, and basically that is set dynamically here with the ID that I set with the animation state. And the animation state is set as we saw before in that perform action. So it gets the value left, and then its ID is left, and it will associate the CSS that is associated with that left. And that's how you just move it. It's kind of a cool language, React, or framework. It's a lot easier than I would have expected, although I have a bias towards vanilla JavaScript, although you need to code a lot more than you did over here. And I do like the whole component thing, that you can actually reuse your component. So here I just created a simple button just to test it, but yeah, it's really versatile. So I could have done this, of course, without this component, but I just wanted to play around with a component. I could have just in the render have used button instead of topic, and it would have worked just exactly the same. But you know, you want to experiment with a new framework, so you need to use what is available. So there you have it. We played around with a motion sensor, gesture sensor, that will detect whether we want to kill somebody, marry them, fuck them, or dump them. Now obviously that's a gag. These things can be very useful. For example, if you have an old analog railway, you could sense which direction a train is going. Well, what I want to do is actually put this on a MIDI setup, and I'll be able to swipe presets, or in the case of a guitar, swell up and down, because it also has a motion sensor. So it's actually a very versatile little sensor. And to me, learning React was kind of fun. I definitely want to explore more, get more experience with it, because I think this could have been done a bit more efficiently. But yeah, it's demonstrated it nicely, so I hope you learned something and see you in the next one.